He's one of a handful of public figures in the world today who's universally known. That itself is an accomplishment, but also universally admired, universally respected. He's an international icon. He has this extraordinary and well-justified reputation for huge integrity, huge humility, curiously. This capacity for self-sacrifice, tolerance, and a multitude of other virtues. So he's an exceptional man, and he occupies an exceptional place, I think, in the public's heart. One needs to recognize that Nelson Mandela didn't enter onto the public stage fully formed. What I find really interesting about him is that he formed himself. He repeatedly reconstructed himself. He repeatedly attempted to address his own failings and weaknesses and to construct himself in a superior mold. And the other interesting and not so well-known thing about Nelson Mandela, at the same time, that's the private self I think he's addressing, but he also repeatedly refurbished the public self. He's acutely conscious all of his life about his image. So you can see changes of image right the way through his life, as well as changes in the public self and changes in the private self. Desmond Tutu said when he was asked, when he was overseas by a young child, what qualities it took to be a Nobel Peace Laureate, he said to have a short name, Tutu, that everyone can remember. Then secondly, to have a big nose. And he said thirdly, to have sexy legs. Now, he said that wasn't an entirely foolish comment. He said because really what he was trying to get across, and that was what he was saying about Nelson Mandela himself, was that there's an exercise of constant personal construction and reconstruction, and that's what we need to see. I think possibly the political or public figure who most resembles, for me, Nelson Mandela is Mahatma Gandhi, because he did that same thing as well. Mandela's early life, his early schooling, his early socialization was geared towards training him as a councillor in the Tembu royal court, a traditional councillor, and some kind of legal functionary. These were the limits of his horizons at that point. He had very local ambitions, very limited, in the end, aspirations, confined horizons. We tend to forget about that. We tend to think of him as a self-conscious political figure right from the start, and he wasn't. Even when he began to attend mission schools, and eventually the University of Fort Hare, near Grahamstown, his mental and political consciousness was bounded. At this point, it only extended as far as the borders of the Transkei. His identity was Xhosa. That's what he thought in terms of. It wasn't black, it wasn't South Africa, it was Xhosa. It was really quite surprising to learn that he first heard of the ANC. The first time he heard of the ANC, the African National Congress, was at Fort Hare. And he wasn't particularly impressed. He wasn't really interested. What he was interested in then were sport, music, and women, his image. And his heroes were people like Joe Louis and the big British ballroom dancers of the time, surprisingly. Political figures didn't figure much in his mind and in his life at that point. It took his flight to Johannesburg to escape an arranged marriage which the regent, the Tembu regent, John Kintaba, had set up for him, to broaden his horizons, to broaden his perspectives. He speaks in his autobiography of the impact of Alexandra Township, which was the first place that he lived in Johannesburg, of its extraordinary cosmopolitanism, and it came as a big shock and a big surprise to him. And it was very exciting for him as well. Talks there of sort of shaking off his prejudices and many of his old values and sort of growing again. And you can visibly see him growing. It was in Alexandra which he first experienced the cosmopolitanism of a multiracial and multi-ethnic environment. But he also experienced discrimination. This is quite interesting, as an African for the first time, as black for the first time. And then the first stirrings of political consciousness occurred. It was in Alexandria that he took part in the 1943 bus boycott, which is absolutely pivotal political event in the history of resistance in South Africa. It was a turning point in many ways. And he was there. He was walking to Johannesburg to work, 13 kilometers or whatever it is each way. It was then he passed from being a spectator to a participant, and it's obviously an important moment in his life. In that period too, he joined a law firm. He met Walter Sisulu, who was his lifelong mentor, and he began to acquire, through his work in the law firm and his part-time studies, for a BA in law, he began to acquire a new kind of self-confidence and polish. And you can see him growing. But Walter Sisulu says, at the time that he was he was poor, and Nelson Mandela makes that point. He was very poor at this point in time, but he was acutely conscious of his image, of how he was dressed, and things like that. And politics only gradually began to dawn for him. But in 1944, it was 43. The bus boycott was a turning point. 44, when the Youth League of the African National Congress was formed, was also a turning point because he was a founder member. And he was on the early executive, and that really marks one of the biggest shifts of his life. In the documentary collection in the William Cullen Library, there's an absolutely unique document there, which is the list of the names and the signatures of the group which attended the first meeting of the Youth League, and that's really a very special and rare document. There aren't many Mandela documents from this period of his life, but one in the Wits collection also exposes a particular part of his experience and his struggles at that time. And it's a letter to the Bantu Welfare Trust written in 1947, soliciting support for his studies as a legal student. This reflects many things, but it reflects his poverty at that time, again, out of which he only gradually dragged himself. Once he qualified, of course, he did earn more money, and then he could become a bit of a city slicker. His image changed again, and he bought extremely expensive suits. He bought a big American sedan, which he drove around in. He was a very glamorous figure in Johannesburg of his time. Hlatshwayo, in her autobiography, talks about his incredibly glamorous white silk scarf, which everybody remembered. So here was Mandela, conscious of his image, on the one hand, working on it all the time, but at the same time transforming himself politically. And he's transforming from a Xhosa nationalist now into an African nationalist and an Africanist at this point in time, which the Youth League letter really indicates. Now, the 1950s in South Africa were a period of growing militancy among the African population, resistance to apartheid, resistance to various apartheid measures. One of the key apartheid measures which affected all adult Africans in the towns, and especially younger ones and the youth, were the pass laws and the requirement to carry out a pass, and if one wasn't in possession of a pass, one was liable to arrest. Every African man that one speaks to about this period has accounts of the iniquity of the pass laws and of the injustice of the pass laws. Now, in the documents in William Cullen Library, a whole range of documents on this anti-pass campaign. Nelson Mandela burning his pass, Walter Sisulu burning his pass, and it really was the moment of shift, the moment of change, when there was mass suppression of opposition, of black opposition in South Africa. A shift of government policy of a radical kind, where things like imprisonment without trial, detention for 90, 180 days, 360 days, and torture began. So the Sharpeville massacre of March 21st, 1960 was a critical turning point in the history of South Africa. As a result of Sharpeville, the ANC was banned, the PAC was banned, and no above-ground political organisation could then happen. Mandela, obviously, was arrested, along with thousands of other African political leaders detained at that time. And in detention, they started talking about other modes of carrying on the struggle. And one of those was violence, armed struggle. Now, this wasn't public, and it was confined to a limited group. The ANC as a whole was very opposed to violence. After coming out of detention, Mandela went underground. Walter Sisulu makes a statement in his own autobiography that we needed a leader in jail rather than outside in exile. And there's a change taking place as far as Mandela is concerned. There's new circumstances. He actually is making the ultimate sacrifice of abandoning his family or breaking links with his family and committing himself to a life on the run and probably in jail at the time. So there's a reformulation of his personality going on, and you can see it from many sources. Mandela goes underground, goes on the run. He's publicly known as the Black Pimpernel because he keeps popping up everywhere where nobody expects him, repeatedly ringing up newspaper editors and giving them statements on this and that, and becoming a very, very public figure as a result, more public than ever before. He feels that a chapter is closing in the history of the struggle, and a new one is opening. Old methods of struggle cannot be continued. And what he's signalling actually then is the beginning of the armed struggle as really important moment, another turning point. But what's very important about that is that he has taken the initiative independently. This is unsanctioned. That statement's unsanctioned. He's reprimanded by the ANC executive after that. But thereafter he moves. He's an absolutely central figure in moving towards armed struggle and the formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the ANC. With the formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe, Nelson Mandela became the commander-in-chief. And the organisation sent him on a trip to Africa to gain support for the ANC and for the armed struggle. And he then again changes his persona, he changes his image, and he changes the kind of inner constitution of the man. It's quite interesting to see him reconstructing himself there, because he becomes the dedicated revolutionary at that point. He goes to Algeria. He's incredibly impressed by the Algerian resistance movement, and he trains in Ethiopia as a guerrilla in various forms of armed warfare. And he's now committed himself to a life of total self-sacrifice to a political cause. That's a shift which has been taking place through 1961. It finally culminates in 1962 when he's in Africa. He's now the guerrilla revolutionary with beard and fatigues, army fatigues he wears. And he eventually comes back to South Africa. He arrives at Liliesleaf, the Liliesleaf farm, which is the headquarters of MK, just outside Johannesburg, in this attire. And he drives through the border in this attire. Now, this is risky. And he, at Liliesleaf, he leaves his diary of his African trip and asks them to burn it. Up to this point, the armed struggle had been centered on sabotage and avoiding at all costs any loss of human life. And it was an attempt to bring the government to its senses rather than to really exert serious pressure on it. But that had failed, and all the MK and the ANC had got was more repression. So on the table at Rivonia in 1963 was a document called Operation Maibuya, which was a blueprint for armed guerrilla struggle in the countryside, and it was drawn up by Joe Slovo and Govan Mbeki. Most of the people present at that meeting knew that Liliesleaf Farm, which had been their base, was insecure. This was the very last meeting that was ever to be held at Liliesleaf. Govan Mbeki said to me, he said, they were sitting there discussing this document, and a panel van drew up outside the house. The back door opened and out poured police, and somebody started shouting, "Police, police." So he knew that this was a staggeringly incriminatory document. He picked it up and he said he was going to try and burn it in the fireplace. So he put his hand inside his boiler suit to get the matches, and he said, suddenly I realized I'd given up smoking 6 months before. So He's got no matches to burn the documents. Shouts, matches, matches. Nobody's got matches. They all try and run away. But there, the document is left there. It's incriminating. It's virtually a death sentence. Not only is the document there, but in the coal cellar, the people looking after Lilies Deep had neglected to observe Mandela's instructions to burn his Africa diary. And at the bottom of the coal cellar, the police found the Africa diary. Now, this was virtually a death sentence for Mandela as well. And they bring him back to be tried once again with the other Lilies Deep trialists. The Rivonia trial was a really massive trial. It was another turning point trial, turning point moment in the history of South Africa. There was every prospect, as the advocates and the attorneys defending Mandela and the other defendants believed, of them being sentenced to the death sentence up to the last minute. Nobody knew whether they were going to be sentenced to death or not. One of the really important bits of the collection in the William Cullen Library are lawyers' records from countless political trials in South Africa. And the first major one of these is the Rivonia trial. And in those records is an astonishing and unique document, which is Nelson Mandela's notes that he made for defending himself in the dock at Lilies Leaf. And in those notes, the draft of the famous statement he made, which was that these were ideals for which, if necessary, he was prepared to die. It's a moment of huge self-sacrifice, because he's prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice of his life. That statement and those moments in the dock and the threat of the death penalty really brought Mandela to international attention. He'd been a very central figure in the public life of South Africa and of the African political consciousness, but more widely the South African political consciousness for some years now. But he hadn't been an international figure. The Cullen Library possesses the Helen Suzman collection, which she donated that collection to the university. And Helen Suzman was one of the few people who took up the cause of the prisoners on Robben Island. Almost nobody else did. And as a parliamentarian, she was able to visit once or twice and to gather information about conditions there. And she was viewed with great affection by the prisoners on Robben Island, and they really valued what she was doing. And it was a major intervention in their lives and the way they were having to live their lives there, which were pretty brutal in the early days. It's a very testing period for Mandela, a tough period, and a period in which it could very easily have happened that he and the rest of the prisoners lost heart, but they maintained extraordinary self-discipline in Robben Island. And you can see that discipline, and they've gone through the fire in the way in which they behaved when they came out of jail. They're a very special generation of people, very special generation of political leaders. Part of the difficulty which they faced, and one of the difficult circumstances which they were aware of, was that the South African government had appeared to be totally successful in suppressing resistance in South Africa. And in fact, the Nelson Mandela and the Robben Islanders were forgotten. They were forgotten by the public. They fell out of the public eye. And that only changes in 1981, when both inside and outside of South Africa, the ANC decided on a new campaign, the Free Mandela campaign. Now, the whole lot of attention centres on Mandela. Mandela beginning to occupy the public stage and moving towards that status of an international icon, which he does in the latter stages of his incarceration, and they're reflected in various documents in the collections as well. The great strength of Nelson Mandela, in my view, is his capacity to repeatedly to recognise his own weaknesses, to confront them, to transcend them, and to improve himself. And that speaks of a basic humility, which alongside his undoubted courage and his willingness to lead, even when that involves himself in personal dangers to his own political reputation. I think those are the qualities which I think are special about him. The William Cullen Library at the University of the Witwatersrand contains probably the richest collection of documents and materials on the political struggle in South Africa.